All righty. Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Procopio. I'm the president of the Public Affairs Research Council. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan watchdog and state research group. I'm very happy to have everyone here today. We do these webinars once a month, trying to bring topics that we think are interesting to you. Today, we're talking about BESE. The Board of Elementary and Secondary Education has 11 members, 8 are elected, and 3 are appointed by the governor. And we have 3 wonderful members joining us today. We have Vice President Lance Harris, who represents the 5th District personally from Alexandria, my old stomping grounds. Preston Castille, who represents the 8th District. I frequently see him around the building I work in. and we have Simone Champagne, who is an appointee of the governor. Also serves, as full disclosure, she occasionally serves on, when we have them, our PAR Constitutional Advisory Council, particularly helping us out with local government. Thank all of y'all so much. A little word about format. I will start with a few broad questions, and then Melinda will have a few others. Then we want to turn as quickly as we can to questions that y'all have. So if you would put them in the question and answer or the chat function, I'm hoping most of what we do is go through your questions. It typically happens, we usually run out of time before we run out of questions. So please get your questions in earlier. The earlier you can get them in, the more likely we're going to answer them. Melinda may also particularly group similar questions together or rephrase them for our panelists. So with that, let's dive in. So okay, broadly, just an opening question. What's one thing you're hoping BESE will accomplish in the next 4 years during this administration? I'm going to start with Preston, since you're the veteran on here. What's one thing you'd like BESE to accomplish over the next 4 years?
Thanks, Stephen. I think one thing that I'd like to see us accomplish is continue our progress as it relates to literacy. We've made some good strides over the last few years, moved up in our national rankings in terms of growth for students and generally and for disadvantaged students. I think when we make tremendous progress as it relates to literacy, it opens doors for children in all other areas. If you can read and write, there is not a whole lot that you cannot accomplish as a student. And that's been holding us back as a state for a long time. But I think as we improve in that area, probably as a leadoff, it opens the door for improvements in that.
Fantastic. All right, thanks. Lance.
Yes, sir. I tell you what, I want to kind of piggyback with Mr. Castille. Literacy piece is very important, and we've made some really good strides, I think, as a state, moving in the right direction. But to add something else to that, I think that I would love to see BESE be able to get an accountability system that is fair, more simple, and then one that would actually incentivize the systems to do what's best for the students. So I think there'll be some really good work on that in the very near future. And I hope that by the end of this 4-year session, we'll have one that everybody just loves.
That's a high bar. Everybody doesn't love anything as far as I'm
Absolutely.
but hopefully I like the high expectations. Simone?
Sure, thank you. I do agree with Dr. Castille and Mr. Harris on their 2 initiatives. I would also like to do the deep dive into the MFP. We need to make sure that our funding mechanism is sustainable so that we can educate our children and adopt good policies and give those parental choices that they deserve. So my focus a lot will be on the MFP and making sure that that funding mechanism is sustainable all the way across the board.
Great. And I hope we'll be able to do a deeper dive later in this webinar, because I think there's a lot of interest in that. It's sort of related. Sure. So first tough question. We didn't wait long. Teacher pay raises. We have a sort of a $200 million right now stipend for teachers. That is in the governor's executive budget. So really trying to get your thoughts on, do you want to see temporary stipends, or would you prefer a permanent pay increase? Do you think it should be across the board, or should it go to more high need areas? What are your general thoughts? Let's go. Lance, why don't you start first, and then we'll go around.
Well, I'll be glad to start that. I would prefer to see permanent pay raises. In fact, last year's MFP had that in it. I supported that MFP through the process. We got it out of my committee as chairman of education, but it wasn't used by the legislature. In particular, this year, the governor has put in 196 million, I believe, for a one-time stipend for teachers. And one thing that we're doing, I think, as a board is listening and communicating with the legislators, the governor's office, and as a Bessie board, to move forward on the finances, because they are facing a deficit next year of quite a big deficit, when I've been through that before. So I would support and look for, providing everybody was for it, a permanent pay raise. But we need to get the teachers something, and if the legislature and the governor say it's a stipend, I'm willing to work with that.
Okay. Simone?
Yes, sir. I believe in the differential pay system. I also, at this point in time, until we can do a deep dive into that MFP that I've spoken about and the funding mechanisms, I do support what the governor's doing as a stipend this year. So I would like to see that continue until we can, what I call it through the meetings, is scrub the MFP. Start at the bottom and make our way all the way to the top, from level 1 to level 4. And look at what's working, look what's not working, and see if we can find that funding in that MFP mechanism before we set those raises into the MFP. I think that really has to be done. I think it is crucial, and it's financially prudent, I think, on Bessie to do it that way, and LDOE, until we can make sure that the MFP is sustainable. Lance hit on it a little bit. I know we're looking at a deficit next year. So to be able to get all those critical areas and the policies that are being put in place and the wonderful programs, I mean, tutoring is a new program, and it's really turning out very well for our children. So that's what I would like to see before anything is put directly into the MFP.
All right, Preston, finish up on this one.
Yeah, teachers are the most important thing that we have in education. And so if we've got really good, high quality teachers, we've got great outcomes. And we've had an outpouring and outmigration of teachers. They've left our state, they've left the profession. And not just leaving for other districts and other states, but they're literally leaving the profession because they can't earn a living. So I'm a big proponent of supporting our teachers. The last several recommendations that came out of Bessie, I was a strong supporter of pay raises for teachers. Stipends make it difficult. I understand we're all want to be as conservative as we possibly can in protecting our budget for the long term. But if we're going to invest in education and truly mean it, I think we've got to start prioritizing our teachers. And so that's critically important. I do think that differentiated pay is important as well, because those who are working in the more challenging areas, I lead a school system, and it is difficult to find that physics teacher. It is difficult to find those algebra teachers, and those areas where it's difficult to find folks. We've got to respond like business and industry in that regard, so that we can be given some latitude to attract and retain the best and brightest. And we have some really talented folks, and we want to make sure that we reward them properly, as we would want in our own respective jobs.
Great, thank y'all. And just a reminder, everyone, start putting your questions in the Q&A. What happens is about 15 minutes from now, everyone's going to start putting a ton of questions in there. So the earlier, the better. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to PAR's Research Director, Melinda DeLotte.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to zoom out for a second with this question. One of the reasons that we wanted to do a webinar with Bessie members, particularly this time, is because there's been so much turnover on the board with the start of the new term in January. By my count of the 11 members, there are only 3 returning members, and everyone else is new to the board, whether that's because of term limits or because the governor is new and his appointees are new. So I guess I would like from each one of you to talk about, what does that mean for how you see the board operating, and any changes that you expect to the approach that the board might take. And I guess I want to start with Lance because you are vice president, and then maybe Preston after that, since you have the longest perspective, since you're one of those handful of returning members. So Lance.
Well, thanks for the question. And I've got to say, I'm extremely excited about our board and what I've seen so far. I think one of the things that we get for this new board with 8 new members and 3 existing members, thanks to Mr. Castille, we have a lot of experience still on the board. But we are kind of doing things a little bit differently than what I have seen in the past as chairman of education. We're communicating with the legislature, with our superintendents, and I'm so excited to see everybody's enthusiasm about getting everybody to work together toward those same common goals that we all have, which is the improvement of our children's education. And so far, it's been extremely exciting for me to see the board members engage with all the stakeholders, and there's more to come. And so I think that the communication that we've been able to foster with the different groups has been very helpful and will continue to be. So I'm really excited about this board and their can-do attitude and their goals that they've set for themselves. And I think it's going to be exciting to track it throughout the 4 years.
Preston, your perspective, because obviously this is a lot of turnover. Have you already seen sort of different things or different approaches and how the new members are coming in?
Yeah, it's been different, but in a good way. First, let me salute those Bessie members who served with me the last 8 years. I would say very, very often that the board that we had was extremely talented, bright. We lost a couple of PhDs that were on the board that rolled off. Just an extremely smart board and thoughtful, very diverse in their thinking. And that brought for a lot of excitement around a lot of topics because we had a lot of differences of opinion. Now, I will add to what Lance said, and that is this board, likewise, I'm excited about that. The fact that I'm on this webinar with Lance Harris and Simone Champagne is just phenomenal because, they're veterans from the legislature, and to Lance's point, to have that level of communication and understanding across not just Bessie and policy, but from the lawmaking side of things with the legislature is a huge benefit to us. We've got 4 legislators. When I approached this job, people sort of said, people serve on Bessie and it's sometimes a stepping stone to some other office. But the fact that we've got 4 former legislators that are now serving on Bessie, one, I think that says a lot about the work of Bessie in general. But education, it means that a lot of really important people in this state value education, its importance, so the overall health of our state, the economy, and it has so many parts that it connects with. So while we've got 8 new members, I don't think the learning curve is all that great. Lance is the former chair of the House Education Committee. We've got Conrad Appel, who's the former chair of the Senate Education Committee. We've got a lot of experience that's come to the table to join us. So while I thought the last iteration, Bessie, was great, I'm excited about what this version will do. And I think that we'll get a lot accomplished.
And Simone, let me twist this question a little bit for you. Both Lance and Preston have brought up the former legislators angle. Bessie hasn't always had the greatest working relationship with the legislature. It seems to vary from time to time. Do you think being a former legislator and having so many former legislators on Bessie will sort of reshape that relationship and maybe lead to a more collaborative relationship?
I completely agree with that. And I've seen it already, the relationship that we have formed. And I want to thank Dr. Castille and the 2 former members that were on Bessie for us having the opportunity to tap into their knowledge also. I mean, we need to do that. But I already see where there's communications between the legislature, the governor's office, and the superintendent plays a very large role in that. So I think I'm gonna call it opportunity for the new members. I see an opportunity to move education forward and continue the progress that has been made in the last few years, with the exception of now we will have a true working relationship with the legislature, the governor's office, and our stakeholders in general. So yes, I completely agree. I see that change. I see it
Okay.
as a positive change, a very positive change.
And let me ask you quickly, was there any particular marching order you got from Governor Landry when he appointed you to this position? Was there something specific he asked from you for policies on the board?
No, not as of right now. Just if I wanted to accept the appointment, and I told him I was truly honored to be able to accept that appointment. And I think education is the key to everything we do in this state. It's our economic value, and our children are our largest assets, and trying to keep them here. But there was no marching order or any policy initiative that we have discussed thus far.
So far. There's still
So far.
time.
I just said so far.
Well, we are getting some questions in from the attendees who are watching, so please submit them via the Q&A function or the chat if you have them. But I'll start with this one, which is near and dear to Par's heart, which is, what are your plans for providing access to quality early care and education for all children in need? Obviously, though we think about Bessie and we think about K through 12 education, Bessie does have a role in the early childhood education spectrum. So what priority will you be placing on that? And how do you hope to improve quality access for children in need? And I'm going to just start with Preston, because I'm looking at you first.
When Stephen asked the question at the beginning in terms of top priority, and I sort of waffled a little bit because early childhood education is so incredibly important. The fact that we've taken more ownership in that regard is important. That we're providing more oversight, accountability, I think is also important. And I say that because, like I mentioned, that literacy is important, but what we find is that when children come to us in kindergarten and first grade, that they're so far behind that we're playing catch up almost from day one with students. So I think we've now come to the realization that it's important that we continue to find ways to fund early childhood education more. I think we've got to continue to do that. And I think every time we get a little bit closer to almost birth in terms of supporting families, the better off we are. So I think on one hand, I think we continue to provide support. We provide some accountability so that we can track the progress so that we know how we're doing as a state. But I think we've got to continue to find sustainable funding mechanisms to support good quality early childhood education programs. So I like the steps that we've taken initially. I think if you look at the state's top priorities, early childhood education falls right there at number one. And I think that we've got to continue to push that envelope as much as we possibly can, because it really gets us that much further ahead because we start off so far behind in kindergarten.
Simone, let me ask you about this. Obviously, funding is tight right now. Early childhood is going to be seeking more funding. Is that a priority for you as a member of Bessie?
Yes, it is. Now, when I say it's a priority, I really have a lot of priorities at this point. But yes, it is a priority, because we have to remember our children, our parents work. So sometimes 8 hours a day, they're in another environment. That's planting that seed for them for when they get into kindergarten, K through 12. So I think that seed that's being planted needs to be nourished, and funding it will be. But then I go back to the MFP, and we have to find that funding. We have to make it one of our priorities, which I'm sure it is. I haven't spoken to all the Bessie members, but I would think they all feel the same way, that early childhood is a priority. And like Dr. Castille said, accountability and the funding mechanism are all things that we have to look at in that formula for early childhood, but most definitely.
Okay. And Lance, your take on early childhood education and
look,
Bessie's role.
It's hugely important. I mean, it's one of the things that we must focus on as a state. Looking over the 12 years of my experience in the legislature, it was the buzzword the first few years when I was there. Finally, everybody started realizing how important early childhood education is to our students and to our parents. And it was really refreshing to see the funding over the last few years, and we've got to continue funding that. And I can tell you, like right here in Central Louisiana, we have a push where our Rapides Foundation is matching $2 for every dollar raised by the private sector to match with state funds to draw down to send these kids to early childhood education. It's a wonderful program. I think you're seeing that all over the state because finally we're all realizing how important it is to the success of our students they have that foundation. So I think one thing that this Bessie board can do, and as a member of Bessie, I can be a cheerleader for early childhood education, and I can say how important it is. Here's the data. Legislators, governor, please fund this if we're really serious about having these kids on a successful path, we've got to give them that foundation. So I'm all for it, and I hope we can continue to go in the right direction.
Oh, but can I add something?
Sure.
I was watching 60 Minutes last night, and during the episode of 60 Minutes, there was a piece on China and our competition with China as a nation, and how it has very much become a superpower and an economic superpower, but it's also become sort of an intellectual superpower. And it reminded me that sometimes here in Louisiana, we're thinking about how we comparing ourselves to other parishes or to the state. But while I was watching that piece, I just couldn't help be moved by the fact that our competition is global competition, and we have to have a very concerted, aggressive plan for how do we compete academically, intellectually with the world. And I think it starts from the very beginning, the moment that someone comes into this world, preparing them for success to be able to compete in the global marketplace. And I just say that because sometimes, again, we look at what's happening here in Louisiana, but it is really the planet that we're competing with to be successful. And every advantage that we can give our children to be successful, starting as early as we possibly can, will be critically important.
Okay. So looking at some of the other questions, we have someone asking about the industrial tax exemption program. Obviously, that program gives property tax breaks to manufacturing facilities, and it takes away some money that could otherwise go to school systems. And so somebody is asking, given the funding problems that education faces and that the state faces, would you favor removing schools from the ITEP program? In other words, that they would not lose any of the property tax money. Would any of you favor such a thing? I think I know what the governor's answer would be about that, since he's already issued his executive order. But is that something that you think would be useful to help education funding?
Well, I'll say this. I think the ITEP is a very, very good tool for Louisiana to be able to attract business and industry, especially to us in the rural communities at times. So I think there's been some really good discussion about ITEP over the years. And I think that that discussion needs to continue. And there is a balance. I think there is a balance. It is the local people's money. So I have to say, I do like the fact that locals do have a voice in some respects now on ITEP. So, and they always have a choice to reject the application. If they want not to give the ITEP, they can do that. So I do believe we need those kind of tools in our toolbox to attract industry, though.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in on this one? Preston?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that I agree with Lance on, uh, it's such a balancing act, and I think the local community has to make a decision as to whether it will benefit the local school district better by having it or not, because I don't think the answer is the same for every community. So I think having that as an option for local districts to consider is an important analysis. It doesn't always go the way we want it to go, and there are a lot of things that factor into that: politics, money. But I think it's an important tool.
Next question. We have, it seems too often that policymakers focus on inputs, essentially describing how the work should be done, rather than focusing on the outcomes expected for students. As BESI members, how will you navigate that issue? And Simone, I'm going to start with you since you got a pass on the last one.
Thank you. You know, I agree. Sometimes, and I say that all the time, I was a legislator. Sometimes legislators feel they know how they want something to work, but then don't necessarily always understand the flip side, which would be the LDOE side. So hopefully in going forward with the conversations that we're going to have with legislators, hopefully that legislation, anyone that wants to adopt new legislation, that they discuss it with BESI and LDOE first before that legislation's actually adopted, to kind of filter through it and say, okay, it may sound good, but in retrospect, policy may not work as well as the way you want it. Or maybe we could say, as BESI, we can help you with that legislation to be able to make it a positive policy. So I think this goes back to communication with legislators and how they're adopting legislation. But I see that as a positive initiation for us as BESI members to get involved in those processes. And I believe that will happen to adopt policy throughout the state.
Okay. Lance or Preston, would you like to jump in on the input focus versus the output?
I would like to say that, Dr. Brumley has already started looking at this with the Louisiana Teachers Teach Work Group and some other things, because we have discussed it in the legislature for years about let teachers teach. We're interested in the outcomes. I'll give you an example. Some of these things that the teachers have to be certified on every year, everything from watercraft safety to CPR, all of that. I've had some very, very good discussions with legislators that are trying to take some of that burden off of teachers so that they can use that time to sharpen their skills to teach their students to have those better outcomes. So I think it won't just be buzzwords over the course of the next couple of years. It's actually going to be some work, really people putting their nose to the grindstone, or whatever that old saying is, to make sure that some of these things happen. And everyone is concerned about the outcome. A lot has been put on teachers over the years, and we need to put that where it ought to be, and that's in LDOE and BESI, instead of just keep adding stuff.
Okay. Preston, did you want to jump in?
I agree. I would though add though that I understand the question, and it's a difficult line to sort of navigate. But there are times where I just think about around curriculum, and that is BESI doesn't establish curriculum, but I think having some standards around high quality curriculum, being a little bit involved in ensuring that teachers and school districts know what's available, ensuring that there is some consistency across the board. There's something to be said about that. I recognize we're policy making. We're not on the ground. We're not the local school districts, and we're not in the classrooms. But we certainly need to provide appropriate oversight to ensure that there is, the level of quality that we're all expecting in our classrooms, to ensure that our teachers are supported, to ensure that they are getting the professional development necessary so that they can be successful.
Okay. Next question, we have someone who is interested in promoting high school internships, saying that they provide students with a pathway to high wage, high demand careers. They're wondering if any of you would support an incentive to encourage more employers in key industries to offer paid internships, arguing that a lot of students can't afford to take the free internship when they need to make some money. So is there an incentive that you think would be useful to employers or something you would support? Lance, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion around that. In fact, just this past week, Ms. Mellorin and I were with the superintendents in North Louisiana, and this was a big part of the discussion. I think there's several things that we can do to make that happen. We have a great apprenticeship program here in Rapides with some private sector companies that it's very, very successful. One thing we need to do is make sure our accountability incentivizes the schools to look at internships. That's one thing. And then we have to get the word out to employers. And we have to make sure that we are educating our employers what we have available, and then to hopefully have paid internships. We were talking about it last week. Our high school kids are already working at McDonald's or Sonic or somewhere making $10 or $12 an hour. Why not put them in that environment that's going to turn into a career? And this is the perfect opportunity to do it. So I think as we continue to discuss it, continue to let employers know what's available, continue to have superintendents and school systems participate, I think we can grow that program and get the accountability system in alignment to where it incentivizes this kind of behavior in our districts.
Preston or Simone, do y'all want to take up that issue?
I agree with Lance, and I think when we say we're nurturing our workforce, this is just an example of it. We have wonderful internships right now, so it's just to be able to get out and get more of our industry and our businesses involved in that process. We do have quite a few now that do that. So I agree with Lance. So as we move forward, that is a big will make a huge difference when it comes to our workforce.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, we've started a lot of that work with the Fast Forward program, the Jumpstart program. If you read through the literature that's available now, I think the pathways that we're creating now sort of opens the door for that. So I think a lot of that groundwork has currently been established. I think we want to take it to the next level. And I think that's what Lance is referring to in terms of how do we tweak our accountability system to further incentivize that behavior. That is, how do we get high schools to further encourage students to pursue that career pathway that might open the door for partnerships with actual businesses that will offer paying jobs. Our kids are already working, and sometimes they'll miss school to help support their family. And if they're already doing it because they need to support their family, why aren't we trying to figure out ways to have that alignment with businesses and industry that will actually pay the students that are willing to work?
Okay.
So let me jump in with sort of two questions that we have that I think are related. We have one person asking about disruptive students and how it affects teacher ratings and how we deal with that. And then we actually had someone, Lynn in the questions, actually gives us a potential solution with trust-based relational intervention, which I hadn't heard of before, but they happily enough put the link in there so you can kind of follow out with that. But it seems like in terms of kids that have trauma, whether it's abuse or something else that happens, can't trust adults, and so how are they going to trust an adult who's also teaching them? So that's a potential one. So whether it's that specific protocol or methodology that y'all have heard of, or just broadly, how do you think we ought to deal with disruptive students and what's Bessie's role? I think everyone would find that interesting.
Yeah, I just clicked on the link that Lynn provided and popped up the trust-based relational intervention program. I had a similar conversation with someone just this weekend about this sort of approach, and it is extremely difficult for teachers. Teachers want to come to school and they want to teach, and they find themselves oftentimes dealing with behavior issues that become much more of a distraction. But that's kind of the hand that we're dealt because we're dealing with human beings. And teachers play an incredibly important role. Going back to my comments about compensation and support, it's not all about compensation, but if you can find ways to support teachers and support students and give them the tools, and that's why, you know, the earlier question about being prescriptive, we don't want to be too prescriptive, but these are examples of where we can say, look, here are some tools that you can use to help navigate children with behavioral issues. Some schools have to deal with more of that than others, and that's why this work is so complicated, because even with our accountability system, you know, you've got some schools that have to deal with inordinately more challenges as it relates to those types of issues. And how do you factor all of that into consideration? But these are important tools. I think the more we can equip our teachers and our staff, and sometimes it's not just the teachers, but having those persons on site that have the tools that are necessary for them to navigate those challenges will be important.
Simone, Lance, I know we like to talk about the good stuff about getting, promoting literacy in early childhood and apprenticeships, but this is a huge issue, particularly for the kids that are coming from tough households. Any solutions, or how do you, or just an approach on how you think we ought to deal with this?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any solutions. I think identifying those children early on, I would think that, our teachers, we need our teachers in the classroom, we need them to teach. We don't need them to be distracted by disruptive students. So I think we need to identify those early on and offer them some type of, I really don't know what trust-based intervention is. I will look it up though. I
I love
promise.
that they put the link. That was great.
Yeah, but a trust-based intervention may work, but like Preston said, just furnish them the capability to be able to teach their class and give them resources that allows them, when these disruptive students, when it happens, to bring them outside of the classroom for some other type of counseling. I know disruptive students, it may not be the same. We heard a little bit in MFP task force, and I'm familiar with the SROs in the schools, which are really police officers. But a lot of times, I know here where I live in Youngsville, our SROs get to know the students and they interact with the students. It's really very heartwarming when you see them in the schools and how the students actually are very communicated with those officers. I don't believe we need police officers to intervene if a child is having a bad home life. However, I think they can be some type of mentor also in those schools that shows an authority role, which may help. I don't know. I do see a good relationship though in our schools with those SROs.
Thanks. Lance, you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, I think that a lot of this, as Preston and Simone have said, the local districts are going to be the experts that handle a lot of these situations. We may have a disruptive student in central Louisiana that's different than a disruptive student in, say, New Orleans or Baton Rouge. So I think that, the locals, we can supply some of those resources and tools maybe, but they're the ones that's going to have to get a grasp. And I'll make this observation too. We need to make sure we stick to our basics, which are, for instance, truancy. And right now we have a lot of kids that aren't making it a habit to go to school, but we've got to try to find out a way to get them in school, get them re-involved. And, I think that all kind of goes part and parcel, hand in hand. We need that structure, and the locals are going to be the ones that provides a lot of that.
All right, great. Thank y'all.
Okay. Obviously, in the discussion of education, the most important thing is the teacher in the classroom and the preparation that they received. And we are functioning with a shortage of teachers statewide. So we have someone asking about whether or not Bessie is tracking and paying attention to the number of students who are in universities preparing to be K through 12 teachers. Because obviously the pipeline is really critical, and it seems as though the enrollment in some of those university programs has been declining as well. So what can Bessie do to help address the teacher pipeline issue? And is that something that Bessie's already tracking? And I see Lance shaking his head, so I'm just going to start with you.
Well, I was really shocked 2 years ago when we had a bill that we were discussing in committee, and the higher education said they had one or two folks that were actually enrolled in the teaching profession. That they were astounded, as we were, that we didn't have a very good pipeline. That people weren't interested in becoming teachers in in their higher education preparedness. So that's concerning. And I think that there's been a huge amount of discussion around that by this board, a previous board, and the stakeholders. How do we make it better to recruit these teachers? How do we improve the environment? How do we improve the task of being a teacher? And I think there's going to continue to be a lot of discussion about it. I mean, we've had bills to where we've removed some things that were kind of a speed bump to coming into that profession in the legislature. And I think that we have to continue to look at it. And yes, I think Bessie is tracking that, LDOE for sure. Dr. Brumley is always keeping us up to date on what it looks like as far as the teacher shortage and what are those things that we can do to improve. And I mentioned it just a moment ago, is a lot of these things that put a burden on a teacher in their classroom is something that the legislators, the Bessie, and everybody can look to improve, take those burdens off of those teachers, make it a better environment for them to enjoy their work and be the professionals they are. And so I think that discussion will it takes place weekly, and it will continue to do till we make some improvements.
Obviously, I was going to ask you, Preston, so hang on for a second. I mean, being a teacher is incredibly difficult. But one thing that somebody is already suggesting in the Q&A is that significantly increasing pay would help with recruitment for teaching programs. So, Preston, can you talk through what Bessie's already been trying to do and kind of what you see as possible areas of solution to this problem?
Yeah, let me take us back a little bit further though, because we've got to be careful about unintended consequences, and I say that maybe as a warning to our new Bessie members and legislators, because we create policy sometimes and they're well intended, but sometimes they have unintended consequences. I remember about 20 years ago, we were raising standards around teachers in terms of being able to become certified, taking the praxis test, that you had to take the praxis before you could even get into the colleges of education at universities. And we would have at some universities a clog in the pipeline where students who wanted to go into the education profession never get past, for example, praxis tests. And it finally discouraged a lot of young people who were planning to go into the profession to do something different. I know that for a fact that there are some universities that started to create alternative degree programs because there were students that could not get past that barrier. Now that's significant because now we have passed recently laws and policies that make it easier for folks to join the profession. We now have opportunities where folks can be with an associate's degree, become a temporary teacher. We have alternative pathways, and we're sort of fixing the problems that we sort of created in the past. And again, I think that was well intended because we were thinking at the time, we want our educators to be the most prepared, and most capable, which is a very, very good thing to do. But the barriers that we were creating that we didn't perhaps realize made it difficult for folks to enter into the profession. So I say that, one, as it relates to this one particular issue, because now we've got sort of the challenge of the shortage in the profession, But we didn't get there overnight. There were very specific things that happened along the way. And when we talk about pay and other things, I think we really have to think about what would the profession be like without teachers. And frankly, we've gotten a taste of that because when you go to schools and they don't have an Algebra 1 teacher, they don't have a geometry teacher, they don't have a physics teacher, they don't have the teachers to teach, then it really becomes impossible to accomplish any other goals. So I say that so that we can carefully think through what issues we have. But Lance is right. We have been making progress. The Department of Education just shared with us recently, we had like 2,500 teacher vacancies. We cut that down in half last year, and then we're continuing to whittle away with it, at it. It has taken some efforts, but we're sort of undoing some things that we created some time ago. So again, be careful with the policies and laws that we pass because they can have some dire unintended consequences.
Right. Yes, and I'd just like to say, yes, we hear that loud and clear about teacher pay and recruitment. But I do agree with Lance and Dr. Castille, and I was going to quote that Bessie, the former Bessie, as well as Dr. Brumley in the past, have done a very good job of cutting those numbers. And he had reported to us, Dr. Brumley, recently, from 2,500 in the last few years is down to half. So I think we see where those numbers are coming down. Hopefully that recruiting new teachers and fresh minds right out of school. But and I'm gonna go back to teachers that have been in the system for a long time, have great knowledge, and to allow them to do their teaching, not only just new recruits. So I agree with them. We have got to figure out how to make sure that recruiting stays on track and that we do things that can help our teachers and help recruitment kids coming out of college that want to be teachers. So I see that as a positive. I see where Bessie worked on it last time, and we're going to continue that.
Okay. Simone, let me stay with you because you brought up this topic in some of your opening comments about the redoing of the MFP, which I think we probably have everybody who on this call probably knows what the MFP is, but it's the Minimum Foundation Program, which is essentially the K through 12 public school funding formula. So you talked about making changes there and revisiting that formula. I know that's been talked about off and on over the years. Is that's a priority for you? What would you like to see done with it? And what kind of timeline are you thinking? Is it a wholesale rewrite of the formula that you would like?
I would say, I wouldn't say a whole sale of the formula. There's some things that actually work, I'm sure, in the formula. I think we need to, as Bessie or MFP task force, previously, the task force has only met maybe a couple times a year. We are going to start meeting every quarter. What we're going to do, I'm thinking what we may do is by level 1 through 4 and taking each level, getting that input. But when I say scrubbing it, I believe there are programs in that formula that maybe aren't working as well as some of the new programs that we can go ahead and integrate into each other. And we can see some cost savings in those is what I'm hoping when I talk about going back. But basically, yes, what I'm saying is just scrub it from the bottom up, looking at every program that the MFP is funding to be able to find those dollars. Because right now, tutoring, we've been getting a lot of federal dollars. So a lot of those federal dollars, like the tutoring dollars we get right now through ESSER, are going to expire, I think, in September of 24. So those dollars are going away. Well, that program is a very good program, has worked. So we would like to see some of that stay in and be able to go ahead and fund those critical areas. But we're going to be losing a lot of federal dollars. So we have to make sure that we do a better job of when we implement programs, that we're implementing a program that is sustainable. So that is my point about the MFP. We have to be sustainable with our education. Our kids, our teachers are the most important assets we have. So we just have to make sure that formula works and that is working effectively all the way across the board. So yes, I would like to see us go from the bottom up and look at programs and see what's working, what isn't working. Look at the districts and ask the districts to look at their budgets and furnish us with ideas on what is and isn't working for them. That's where you see all like that cooperation that I feel you will have in the next year. I'm looking at a year and
Okay.
hopefully having something. I'm looking at a year, no longer
Pre-
than a year. We have to make this, we have to get it done.
Preston, obviously Bessie over time has sort of piecemealed some new programs into the MFP. Do you think it's time to do a wholesale review as Simone is talking about? And is 1 year realistic for redoing this formula?
I like Ms. Champagne's enthusiasm and the fact that she wants us to be aggressive about it. That's exactly what we should aspire to do. Is it going to be challenging? Yes. Do we need to really look at it in great detail? I think she's exactly right, because frankly, a lot of folks just don't understand the formula. It is extremely complicated. When you start to delve into it, you recognize that it does try to prioritize and support the areas that we are seeking to provide more support in. For example, rural communities, do we give more money to those that need additional support, to more disadvantaged communities? So we have tweaked the formula over the years to try to accomplish developing a formula that supports our values. And I think it's incredibly important to always go back and revisit and make sure it realigns with our current values. And I think where we are now, it is time to look at it more comprehensively. Frankly, over the last few years, at least the 4 years that I've been on, Betsy, we look at the MFP formula and we meet a couple times a year right before it's time to submit something to the legislature. And that's not the right way to do it. We've got to spend time understanding it well in advance. We've got to study it. We got to make sure we're getting as much input. But I think this is an area where it warrants some improvement. There are some people who are, like Betsy, who is the guru about in understanding our formula, but there aren't enough people who do. And I think we need greater input. And I think it is at a minimum probably a year-long process, because it is extremely complicated, and I'm all on board with ditching that and trying to figure out what are the areas that we can improve.
Okay. Lance, anything you want to add to that, or?
Well, we will be digging into it. And I think one of the things that I'm excited about is with Mr. Birkin as chairman of the finance committee, that we're going to start meeting more often to delve into some of these questions, because as Preston just said, just meeting one time, sending it over to the legislature is just not enough for a board that's responsible for that. One thing I think we do have to look at, and Preston and I think Simone both scratched the surface on this, is some of the weighted formulas within the MFP. We got to make sure that the districts that need the resources are getting the resources. And we had a pretty good conversation, or someone brought that up at the last MFP task force meeting. And I think that's something we have to look at. Some of these weighted formulas to make sure that the state's resources are going to where they would do the most good, because some districts are wealthier than others, as we all know. And I think that has to be looked at and addressed in the next year.
Okay. I think Stephen has the next question for you.
Yeah, and I want to make sure we have time for this. I think one of the bigger issues that might be going in the legislature will be educational savings accounts. And just to clarify when we're talking about this, that can mean different things. Sort of, it's a super voucher program that could provide tuition for private schools for some kids. It could be helping with homeschool expenses. It could be providing tutoring. There's a lot of different uses, and that's why it's more a savings account than a voucher per se. The promise, as I understand it, is that it creates a more competitive environment, also can get kids out of trapped failing schools and give them options they didn't have before or couldn't afford. The downside, and I'll tell you, this is one that Power is concerned about, is that if it ends up paying for kids to go to private school who would have gone there anyway, it can get very expensive very quickly. So how do you balance these things out? Just sort of your take on this. I'd like to start with former chair, Lance Harris, who had a bill on this. So we probably know where you are, but I'd love to hear more discussion from you.
Well, look, the data is pretty clear that when done right, these things can be very effective. Very good for those families that need it. I think that the families ought to have choice. The parents ought to be the ones that decide where their child would thrive the most in school. And I think the state needs to be there. I've told this story in committee. You know, I met a lady my first few years in the legislature that she wanted her kid to go to a private school. And she went and worked out with that school that she would be the night custodian to go along with her other two jobs that she had to have to get her kids in that school. And they did go to that school and they graduated and they're successful. But where was the state on that? You know, she was getting them out of a very bad school situation and getting them to where they needed to be because she knew they were talented. She knew what they needed to go to. So I think there is a need for that, and the parents are the ones who should make that ultimate decision, and the state should support that. Now, just like you said, we can't go carte blanche and blow the whole budget up. So I think there'll be a lot of discussion and has been a lot of discussion about that. And I think there are some legitimate concerns as we go forward with that. We had some great discussion last year about the ESAs. I think they would work in Louisiana. I think people are warming up to them if they're done in the right way. And I think we'll see some very innovative instruments this year.
Great. And I would also like to hear the take from other people. Preston, do you want to handle or have any other questions or comments about ESAs?
Yeah, it sort of depends what the legislation is. To Lance's point, there were variations of ESA bills that were presented, and there'll be more. I'm a proponent of choice. I think, families should be very engaged. We want them to be engaged in the education of their children. And so we should do as much as we possibly can to foster it. And I think we've heard from probably this panel that we want to be fiscally responsible at the same time. We don't want to blow the budget. We want to make sure that we continue to help families who can't afford it. So it depends on what it looks like. I'm in favor of choice. Depends on what it looks like. It may work in certain circumstances and not in others. And I say that broadly because it will depend on the legislation and what ultimately comes out. But with the broad concept of choice is a good thing. We want to give parents that opportunity. Let's look at what that means fiscally, and can we afford it without harming other families at the same time. Again, going back to those unintended consequences that in an attempt to help some families, that we don't find ourselves doing more harm than good.
Simone, do you have comments?
Yes, I'm a huge proponent of the ESAs. I don't know what the legislation is going to look like this year. Hopefully, it'll be a phased-in program to where it gives us time on the funding side because it will require some funding. But I always did believe that dollars should follow the child in school. And it gives parents that choice, that parental choice for educating their children, such as Lance just spoke about the lady that had 3 jobs. So to be able to put her children in a private school. So, and there are thousands of parents like that across the state. So I'm a huge supporter of ESAs, and hopefully the phasing mechanism will give us time on the funding side.
Great. Melinda?
Okay, I think this will be one of the last questions since we have to wrap it up. We have a question about, obviously the legislature has issued a resolution to explore this topic. So the MFP is obviously for K through 12 education, but what are your thoughts on creating something similar, some sort of funding formula for early care and education? I know that PAR sits on a task force that is working on that issue, and we have an attendee who is watching who is curious if you would support a funding formula for early childhood. I'm Preston. Let's start with you on this one.
Yeah. If you study the history of education in this country, the more the government has gotten involved in terms of formalizing and funding education, the better the quality of the education system has gotten. We all think that K-12 always existed. It didn't. It took some time for us as a state and a nation to get there. I think the more that we can do to lean in, to pull in those early years into a formal education structure and system akin to K-12, we will be that much more advanced. So I think it's difficult. There's no doubt about it because there are only so many dollars to go around, and that's the challenge. But the sooner we can figure out a solution for that, I think we will benefit in the long run. And we will probably find some cost savings because all the time that we spend remediating in the elementary, middle, and high school, that is created because of the gap that's created from the beginning of the birth of the child to kindergarten. I think that creates a problem. So we might save some money. In the long run, will we benefit? Absolutely, we will benefit from it. Do we know where we're going to get the money to do that? It's going to be the hard part. But should we endeavor to do it? Absolutely.
Money is always the hard part.
Hard.
Simone, would you support a funding formula for early childhood?
If we can find the funding, yes, because I do agree with Preston, that's fundamental. And I believe we'll see some cost savings on the long end, but it's to find the funding. So I'm gonna leave you with this. We have to scrub the MFP and see where all the funding is coming from. And because that will be the true issue. But yes, early childhood, it will play an intricate game in our process of education for our children long term.
I'm noticing a theme with Simone there. Lance, you get the last word on this one. Do you support a funding formula for early childhood?
Yes, I do. And here's why. Every year, my years on appropriation, we'll fund early childhood X amount this year that may reduce it this next year. It needs to be a consistent source of funding for early childhood so that we don't take steps backwards after we funded it for some years. And then all of a sudden the funding's not there, then kids may be knocked out of the program or whatever. So I am looking for a more permanent type funding source for early childhood education.
Righty. Unfortunately, that's all the time we had. We still have some great questions. We just didn't get a chance to. We did about a dozen of them though. So I feel pretty good. I want to thank our panelists. Y'all were great. A model of civic behavior, which we always enjoy on our PAR webinars. And just a lot of questions, education, a lot of interest from everyone across the spectrum and across the state. And I really appreciate it. Just a reminder, this webinar will be on our YouTube channel. And so we will post that out on social media and you can find it on our YouTube channel as well. Thank all of y'all so well. I want to thank all the participants that put in questions and just had a lot, including, links to potential solutions. It was fantastic. And we definitely expected with our PAR audience. Thank y'all again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.